Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Knight b8 to d7. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn h7 to h6. Bishop g5 to h4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn e2 to e3. Pawn c7 to c5. Bishop h4 takes f6. Knight d7 takes f6. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop b5 takes d7, check. Bishop c8 takes d7. Knight f3 to e5. Bishop d7 to c8. Castle kingside. Pawn f7 to f6. Queen d1 to h5, check. King e8 to e7. Knight e5 to f7. Pawn g7 to g6. Knight f7 takes d8. Pawn g6 takes h5. Knight d8 takes b7. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight c3 takes d5, check. Pawn e6 takes d5. Knight b7 to c5. Rook a8 to b8. Rook a1 to b1. Bishop c8 to f5. Knight c5 to a6. Rook b8 to b6. Knight a6 to c7. King e7 to d6. Knight c7 to a8. Rook b6 to b8. Pawn g2 to g4. Pawn h5 takes g4. Knight a8 to c7. Bishop f5 takes c2. Knight c7 to a6. Rook b8 to b6. Rook f1 to c1. Bishop c2 takes b1. Rook c1 takes b1. Rook b6 takes a6. Pawn e3 takes d4. Rook a6 to a4. Pawn b2 to b4. King d6 to c6. Rook b1 to c1, check. King c6 to d6. King g1 to g2. Rook a4 takes b4. Rook c1 to d1. Rook b4 to b2. King g2 to g3. Rook b2 takes a2. Pawn f2 to f3. Pawn g4 takes f3. Rook d1 to f1. Pawn f3 to f2. Rook f1 takes f2. Rook a2 takes f2. King g3 takes f2. Pawn f6 to f5. King f2 to e3. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn h2 to h3. Pawn a7 to a5. King e3 to d3. Pawn f5 to f4. King d3 to c3. Pawn f4 to f3. King c3 to d3. Pawn f3 to f2. King d3 to e2. Rook h8 to f8. King e2 to d3. Pawn f2 to f1, promoting to queen, check. King d3 to c3. Queen f1 to c4, check. King c3 to b2. Rook f8 to f2, check. King b2 to a3. Rook f2 to a2, checkmate.